to discuss his new book. It's called To Govern the Globe, and it's about kind of the rise and fall of empires since the 1300s and some kind of ideas on what might be happening in the future, which is very exciting. And Professor McCoy is a history professor at University of Wisconsin-Madison, and he's the author of several books, including, of course, To Govern the Globe, and other books, including In the Shadows of the American Century, about American military power. And we're honored to have him here today to discuss his new book with us. And with that, would you like to maybe talk a little about the book?
Annika, you're the compeer. You're in charge.
All right. Anything? Do you want to just start off with like just a little bit of an explanation about kind of what your new book is about? Maybe a little bit of an overview. Anything you want to share about it?
Sure. First of all, you mentioned the book. There it is, product placement. Okay. Capitalism, Commerce, Rear is ugly head. And it's just out 2 weeks ago. It's actually rather ambitious. It sweeps through 7 centuries, and not just one thing after another, but tries to trace a continuous thread, seeing the rise and fall not only of empires, but world orders, and doing it through 3 key variables. First of all, changing concepts of human rights, changing concepts of sovereignty, what it is to be a sovereign state, and then finally, seemingly different, but actually intimately integrated, energy. And by tracking this trail of change through these 3 variables over time, one can see, first of all, a whole new level of global governance that most of us didn't think was there. We thought that, there are communities and then nations or nation states and then empires. But actually, it turns out that above empires is a level of global governance called a world order. And what distinguishes a world order from an empire is a number of critical variables. First of all, empires on the surface are much more substantial. They're oftentimes have boundaries. They're enforced by military action. The members of the empire are bound together by treaties such as NATO or bilateral military pacts. So on the surface, empires seem to be strong, serious, and substantial. And world orders, by contrast, are a bit ephemeral. They're elusive. Empires represent power, and world orders represent principle. So world orders are this element that permeates the fabric of whole civilizations. World orders determine often the languages people speak, the religions that they practice, the way they work, the laws they follow, and even the games they play. And they are pervasive, and they can outlast the empires that created them. And thus, this deeply rooted form of global governance called world order requires a major cataclysm, a coincidence between some geopolitical change and some catastrophe to uproot them and to give way to a new world order. And right now, we are at the cusp of such a change. And that's what I want to talk about in the prepared remarks I have tonight. So Annika, with that, should I just launch right into my prepared remarks?
Yeah, that sounds great.
Okay, thank you, Annika. Right, when the leaders of over 100 nations gathered at Glasgow for the UN Climate Conference last month, there was much discussion about the disastrous effect of global warming on the environment. But there was little discussion and less awareness of the possible political impact, particularly on the current world order that made such international gatherings possible. World orders, as I said earlier, are deeply rooted global systems that structure relations among nations and the conditions of life for the millions of people that live within them. And for the past 600 years, it has taken a catastrophic event, such as war or plague, to overturn such entrenched global systems. Within a decade, however, climate change will be wreaking a cumulative devastation sufficient to surpass past catastrophes, creating conditions for the eclipse of Washington's liberal world order and for the rise of Beijing's decidedly illiberal one. In this sweeping imperial transition, global warming is catalyzing a veritable witch's brew of change that is eroding America's once unchallenged hegemony and its world system. By charting the course of climate change, we can draw something akin to a political roadmap for the rest of this tempestuous 21st century, starting with the end of US global hegemony around the year 2030, the end of this decade, through Beijing's rather brief world leadership until something like 2050, all the way to this century's closing decades of environmental crisis, which may yet produce a new kind of empowered world order to mitigate, to cope with this global disaster. Let's turn to the first topic, the bipartisan effort that produced US decline. America's decline started right here at home as a kind of bipartisan project. Now, while Washington was spending 2 decades fighting very costly wars to secure the Middle East oil, when that fuel was about to join cordwood and coal in the dustbin of history, Beijing was using those same years to build industries that would make it nothing less than the world's workshop. And in a major miscalculation, Washington admitted Beijing into the World Trade Organization in 2001, bizarrely, curiously, hubristically confident, even overconfident, that a compliant China would somehow join the global economy on America's terms without changing the balance of power. According to two former members of the Obama administration, and I quote, "Across the ideological spectrum, we in the US foreign policy community shared the underlying belief that US power and hegemony could readily mold China to the United States' liking. All sides of the policy debate aired." A bit more bluntly, foreign policy expert John Mearsheimer, writing in the pages of the prestigious Journal of Foreign Policy, concluded that, quote, "Both Democratic and Republican administrations promoted investment in China and welcomed the country into the global trading system, thinking it would become a peace-loving democracy and a responsible stakeholder in a US-led international order." In the 15 years following China's admission to the World Trade Organization, Beijing's exports to the United States grew fivefold to 460 billion annually. China's foreign currency reserves surged from just 200 billion to an unprecedented, an extraordinary $4 trillion by 2014, a vast hoard of cash that Beijing used to build a modern military and win allies across Eurasia and Africa. Meanwhile, Washington was wasting a similar $8 trillion on profitless wars in the Middle East in lieu of spending on infrastructure, innovation, or education, a time-tested formula for imperial decline. When the Pentagon conducted an investigation, a kind of assessment of the Afghan war, they interviewed a former White House staffer and a Navy SEAL veteran named Jeffrey Eggers. Here's what he said, quote, "What did we get for this $1 trillion effort in Afghanistan? Was it worth $1 trillion? After the killing of Osama bin Laden, I said Osama was probably laughing in his watery grave, considering how much we have spent on Afghanistan." Donald Trump's presidency brought a glowing realization at home and abroad that Washington's world leadership was ending far sooner than anyone could have imagined. For 4 years, Trump attacked longstanding US alliances while degrading the international organizations that had long been the hallmark of Washington's world system. And to top that all off, he denounced a fair American election as fraudulent and sparked a mob attack on the US Capitol, almost mocking America's long history of promoting democracy to legitimate its global leadership. In that riot's aftermath, the Republican Party has embraced Trump's demagoguery about electoral fraud as almost an article of faith. No nation can exercise global leadership if one of its ruling parties descends into a persistent irrationality, something Britain's Conservative Party showed clearly during its imperial decline back in the 1950s. After his inauguration last January, President Biden proclaimed, quote, "America is back." He promised to revive Washington's liberal international leadership. But European leaders, mindful of Trump's battering of NATO, continued to make plans for their own common defense without America. As one French diplomat put it, and I quote, "We aren't in the old status quo where we can pretend that the Donald Trump presidency never existed and the world was the same as 4 years ago." Biden's humiliating retreat from Afghanistan, as Taliban guerrillas equipped with tennis sneakers and aging Soviet rifles crushed an Afghan army armed with billions in US gear, showed the world that America's decline had become a bipartisan project. Global leadership lost is not readily recovered, particularly when a rival power is waiting in the wings, prepared to fill the void. As Washington's strategic position weakens, China has been pressing relentlessly to displace it and dominate the vast landmass of Eurasia, that's to say Europe and Asia, home to 70% of the world's population and productivity, and thus the key to Beijing's path to global primacy. Should China's relentless advance continue, there will be serious consequences for the world as we know it. Now, admittedly, the current global system is, to say the least, imperfect. While using its unprecedented power to promote a liberal international system based on human rights and inviolable sovereignty, Washington has simultaneously violated those same principles in pursuit of its own national self-interest, a disconcerting duality between power and principle that has afflicted every global order since the 16th century. As the first hegemon that did not participate directly in the painful 5-century process of forging this liberal world order, China's rise could ultimately threaten this order's core principles of universal human rights and inviolable state sovereignty. Beyond Washington's strategic failings, there is, however, another far more fundamental force eroding its global power. After 70 years of profligate fossil fuel consumption, synonymous with Washington's world system, climate change is now gaining sufficient force for profound disruptions of the human community. Through the past 20 years of bipartisan denials, evasions, and compromises, the United States, as of 2019, still relied on fossil fuels for 80% of its energy and renewables for only 20%. The situation was even worse in China, which in 2019 depended on fossil fuels for a full 85% of its power and generated only 13% from renewable resources. As energy expert Vaclav Smil has explained, the underlying problem is 150 years of embedded inertia that made it, quote, "the production, delivery, and consumption of fossil fuels the world's most extensive and the most expensive web of energy-intensive infrastructures." In any transition beyond fossil fuels, the world's two largest economies, China and the United States, would have to play a determinative role. Global carbon dioxide emissions rose by a staggering 50% from 22 gigatons in 1997 to a peak of 33 gigatons in 2018. Significantly, China accounted for 30% of the world's total, and the United States nearly 14%. So the two powers together produce a combined 44% share, nearly half of all greenhouse gases. At the 2019 Madrid Climate Conference, the UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, warned that if current emissions continue, global warming could reach as high as 3.9 degrees centigrade by the end of this century, with what he called catastrophic consequences for all life on the planet. And at the Glasgow UN conference last month, He renewed this warning, saying, and I quote, "We are digging our own graves. Sea level rise is double the rate it was 30 years ago. Oceans are hotter than ever and getting warmer faster. Parts of the Amazon rainforest now emit more carbon than they absorb. We are still careening toward climate catastrophe," end quote. In the 600 years since the age of exploration first brought the continents into close, continuous contact, 90 empires, large and small, have come and gone. But there have been just 3 new world orders, which survived each in turn until it suffered some cataclysm of mass death. After the Black Death of 1350 killed 60% of medieval Europe's population, the Iberian empires, Spain and Portugal, expanded overseas to form the First World Order, which lasted a full 300 years until 1805. Just as the devastation of the Napoleonic Wars launched the succeeding British imperial system, which continued for a full century until 1914, so Washington's hegemony and its current world order arose from the extraordinary destruction of World War II. But now global warming is unleashing cataclysmic environmental changes that will soon overshadow these past catastrophes and damage, if not destroy, the global order that has pervaded the planet for the past 70 years. As wildfires worsen with each succeeding summer, ocean storms intensify, lands aridify, and the seas rise, many millions among the world's poor will be uprooted from their precarious perch along seashores, floodplains, and desert fringe. Now, if we recall that between 2016 and 2018, the arrival of refugees at the border of the European Union and the United States unleashed an extraordinary surge of right-wing populist demagoguery seen in Britain's Brexit, Europe's ultranationalism, and Trump's election. And you add them all up, the refugees, the Africans crossing the Mediterranean to Europe, the Middle Easterners coming through Turkey and Greece into Europe, the Central Americans crowding in at the US border. And in that period, 2016 to 2018, it was only 2 million people. Well, just imagine the political upheaval to come when climate change generates, according to the World Bank, anywhere from 200 million to 1.2 billion climate change refugees by the middle part of this century. As 1 million refugees crowd America's southern border every year, while storms and fires batter this country's coast and countryside, the US will have to retreat from the world to cope with these domestic crises. Similar and simultaneous pressures worldwide will cripple the international cooperation that has long been the core of Washington's world order. So, we might ask, when will the shifting geopolitics and the climate cataclysm come together, converge to erase, to eclipse Washington's liberal world order? Well, let's look at some dates. Beijing plans to complete both the technological transformation of its own economy and much of its massive trans-Eurasian infrastructure of rails, roads, and gas pipelines by 2027. That projected date complements a prediction by the US National Intelligence Council, which is kind of the supreme analytic body within the US intelligence community, which said, and I quote, "China alone will probably have the largest economy, surpassing that of the United States a few years before 2030. More recently, the accounting firm PricewaterhouseCoopers projected that by 2030, China's GDP would grow to 38 trillion and be over 50% larger than America's at just 24 trillion. Now, since Beijing and Washington's defense budgets represent roughly 2% and 3% respectively of their economic outputs, China's military, which is already the world's second largest, should be comparable or even more powerful than America's around 2030. leaving Washington militarily dominant only in the Western Hemisphere. Indeed, already China has the world's most sophisticated anti-ballistic missile system and some of the world's most sophisticated ballistic missiles. Apologies. The New York Times reported, The New York Times reported that as of 2019, quote, in 18 of the 18 last Pentagon war games involving China in the Taiwan Strait, the US lost. In other words, the Pentagon was projecting and, doing their usual maneuvers, counter maneuvers, that if a war between China and the US came over Taiwan, the United States would lose. As China pushes its maritime frontier further into the Pacific, engulfing and threatening Taiwan, Washington may well be faced with a difficult choice, either abandon an old ally or fight a war that it will probably lose. Weighing Beijing's global future, it seems safe to assume that China can gain enough strength at a minimum to weaken Washington's global grip, and that it might serve, in concert with the accelerating impact of global warming, as a catalyst to effect such a fundamental change in world orders. Now, if China is on top sometime after 2030, how long will its world power last? Well, even if China were to become the preeminent world power around 2030, the accelerating pace of climate change will likely curtail its hegemony within just 2 or 3 decades. Scientists at the nonprofit Climate Central reported in 2017 that rising seas and storm surges could, by 2060 or 2070, flood areas inhabited by 275 million people worldwide, with 80% of those in Asia. According to corroborating research, Shanghai is, quote, the most vulnerable major city in the world to serious flooding. The most vulnerable major city in the world. The group's scientists report that nearly 18 million people in Shanghai are likely displaced, as most of the city, quote, could eventually be submerged in water, including much of the downtown area. Advancing the date of that disaster by at least a decade, a 2019 report in the scientific journal Nature Communications found that 150 million people worldwide are now living on land that will be below the high tide line by 2050. Using artificial intelligence to correct past errors in measurements of the elevations of major cities worldwide, which the article said were far too optimistic, the research determined that by 2050, rising waters, quote, threatened to consume the heart of Shanghai, thereby crippling one of China's main economic engines. Dredged from sea and swamp in the 15th century, much of Shanghai will, in little more than 30 years, return to the waters from whence it came. Now, while rising waters threaten Shanghai's survival, increasing temperatures will devastate the North China Plain, a prime agricultural region between Beijing and Shanghai, currently home to 400 million people, potentially making this core area of China the most lethal place on the planet. According to an MIT professor, Professor Alatir, a specialist in hydrology and climate, quote, this spot is going to be the hottest spot for deadly heat waves in the future. Between 2070 and 2100, he estimates, the region would face hundreds of periods of extreme danger when a combination of heat and humidity reaches what's called a wet bulb temperature of 31 degrees centigrade. More dangerous still, this heartland region of northern China will face perhaps 5 periods of lethal 35-degree wet bulb temperature. Now, what's that? That's when a combination of heat and humidity prevents the evaporation of sweat that cools the human body. After just 6 hours under a wet bulb temperature of 35 degrees, a healthy person at rest will die. If the Chinese century does indeed start around 2030, it's unlikely to last long, ending perhaps sometime around 2050, when its main financial center at Shanghai is flooded and its northern agricultural and industrial heartland is baking in insufferable heat. Now, given that Washington's world system and Beijing's emerging alternative are largely failing to limit carbon emissions, by mid-century, the international community will quite likely need a new form of global governance to contain the damage. After 2050, the international community might quite possibly face a growing contradiction, a head-on collision, if you will, between the foundational principles of the current world order, which are national sovereignty and human rights. As long as nations have the sovereign right to seal their borders, the world will have no way of protecting the human rights of the hundreds of millions of climate change refugees anticipated by 2050. By 2050, if not earlier, the inability of nations, no matter how powerful, to cope with this crisis in the global commons should, I think, become blindingly apparent. Now, if China were to turn inward to cope with its own climate crisis by mid-century, and the world were to face the spectacle of mass suffering by countless millions of climate change refugees, the community of nations might well agree on the need for a new kind of collective response and a more empowered form of global governance. Now, such a supranational body or bodies would need something akin to sovereign authority over three critical areas: emission controls, refugee resettlement, and environmental reconstruction. First, if the transition to renewable energy sources is still not complete by 2050, and it probably won't be, then this international body might well compel nations to curb emissions and adopt renewable energy. Next, whether under the auspices of the UN or a successor organization, someone akin to the UN High Commissioner for Refugees would need the authority to supersede state sovereignty by requiring nations to help resettle such tidal flows of humanity. Finally, the future equivalents of the International Monetary Fund, World Bank, and other financial organizations could transfer resources from wealthy, temperate countries to feed tropical communities and reconstruct the decimation from climate change. These massive programs would, of course, change the very idea of what constitutes a world order from the diffuse, almost formless ethos of the past 5 centuries into a very concrete form of global governance. Now, at present, obviously, no one can predict with any certainty whether such reforms will come soon enough to slow climate change or arrive too late to accomplish anything but management of the endlessly escalating damage of uncontrollable environmental feedback loops. But one thing is quite clear. The environmental changes in the offing are so profound that anything less than the emergence of a new form of global governance, one capable of protecting the planet and the human rights of all its inhabitants, introduces a strong prospect of armed conflict as wars over water, land, and people erupt in every part of the planet. Absent some fundamental change in our global governance, then humanity will, by mid-century, begin to face disaster of an almost unimaginable kind that will make imperial orders of any sort something for the history books. Thanks.
All right, thank you so much. And I'm thinking I have a few questions prepared, and also I see a few questions in the chat. So if anyone has any questions, feel free to put them in the chat and I'll ask as many as we have time to get to. So the first question I see is, you talked a lot about this at the end, the new international body that's needed to address climate change. And there's a question about how it might enforce surrendering national sovereignty, or how countries like China, the US, Russia, and other countries might feel about giving up their national sovereignty. Just wondering if you might want to address that.
Well, first of all, it's a very limited kind of concession. I mean, think about the restraints on national sovereignty, if you will, today. In theory, that when a nation transgresses, invades another country, the UN Security Council will implement sanctions, economic, sometimes military. All right. Uh, um, and as has happened in Cambodia, if a government is deemed to be incapable of governing its own people, the UN created a kind of interim government, UNTAC, the UN Transitional Authority for Cambodia, that for a couple of years actually came in and governed Cambodia as a kind of supranational body. Okay, so already, national freedom of action, if you will, not so much sovereignty, has been circumscribed by the international community. And there are all kinds of complex rules that govern interaction, trade, communications, and it's very possible that we could simply deem emissions to be a form of aggression, that putting emissions into the global commons and threatening the survival of the rest of humanity represents a transgression akin to, and maybe even greater than, invading another sovereign state. So, it's just an extension of an existing principle. But of course, in your question, there's a reality. Who is going to tell a superpower what to do? Well, that's the problem. Nobody can actually, enforce this on a superpower. So much of this will have a kind of moral authority, and that's actually the ultimate sanction so far that the loose system of global governance that we have today.
And sort of adding on to that, with the next question here, do you think the UN could be like a good source of international cooperation in the climate crisis, or do you believe that you need to create like a new body with more international authority?
The trouble with creating a new body is that the circumstances that led to the formation of the UN were absolutely unique. I mean, World War II was extraordinary in its destruction. And by the end of the war, the world was acutely aware of the horrors of the Holocaust. The whole idea of the existing international order of global empires, Britain governing a quarter of humanity directly, France governing 10% of humanity directly, 6 European powers governing what is now 100 nations. Okay, that system, that whole system of imperialism, which grounded upon the idea of a scientific racialism of higher and lesser breeds, all of that, was destroyed by the racialist ideology of the Nazis, which carried that system to its sort of logical extent. And so in that extraordinary moment when the world was ravaged, in which the existing system, the British world order, that was effectively the imperial British world order, which was an imperial system, was effectively discredited. That allowed this unique moment to create the United Nations. So it's, I think, unlikely that we could have such a moment to create an organization. So what should be done, you might ask? And having asked my own question, I'll now answer it, to reform the UN and make it more representative. Well, the General Assembly is fine. The critical problem is the UN Security Council. Originally, when Roosevelt and Stalin and Churchill were thinking about the UN, and they had a kind of preliminary closed-door conference at Dumbarton Oaks in Washington, D.C. in 1944 to talk about the UN, as FDR put it, the General Assembly was to let the little nations blow off steam, but the real power was going to reside in the Security Council. Well, when they went to San Francisco, of course, and there were 50 sovereign nations present, and the Latin American delegates arrived with very different ideas, and all kinds of civil society groups like Jewish groups, African American groups all arrived, religious groups, and in that emerged a very different kind of UN. But the core of power remained. The 5 great powers got their permanent seats on the Security Council. A simple reform would simply say, well, first of all, if we're going to have permanent seats, they should really be relative to, let's say, some kind of global economic power. So let's take Britain's seat might go to India. I mean, that would seem sensible. Or we might say that we'll have rotating seats, and we'll have regional blocks. So EU would have a seat, North America, there'd be a North American seat, Mercosur, the Arab League, the Africa Organization, ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. These multinational bodies would have seats on the Security Council. And that would make the UN much more fully representative of the international community. And it would remove the veto that really is crippling the UN's capacity to take serious action to compel compliance with its directives. So, I mean, I think some very simple changes could really, produce significant reforms in the way the UN operates.
Yeah, definitely. And then this next question here, I know it's about like regime changing activities and how the United States has kind of been involved in regime changes from war in Spain until CIA after World War II and up until the present. I know you mentioned this in your book, In the Shadows of the American Century. I was just wondering if you could maybe speak to that a little bit more.
Sure. Good question. Look, when the US established its world order in two conferences, the Bretton Woods Conference that created the international economy in New Hampshire in 1944, and the UN conferences that I just discussed in 1944 and 45. In the UN, it enshrined two core principles. One, universal human rights, which are in the UN Charter, but are more expressly articulated in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which was enacted 3 years after the UN was founded in 1948. And the other idea that the United Nations had was that empires and colonies, and in fact, it took the UN until 1961 to pass a motion from the General Assembly equating colonialism with violation of human rights, but it's implicit in the UN Charter. And the idea is that every human being has human rights, and those rights can be realized if everybody has their own sovereign state. So you kind of have an entitlement to universal human rights, and you have entitlement to a sovereign state. And those are the core principles upon which the current international order operates. And undergirding them, of course, is a fabric of law. And there is, of course, an international court created in the UN Charter as well. And so that was principle. Those are the principles of the US international system. And every world order has its principles. But simultaneous with those principles, of course, is the great power that allows you to enshrine those principles in international practice. And that great power, that's the duality that every world order has, that duality between power and principle. So the United States, in pursuit of its global power, of course, violated those principles. Once we enshrine inviolable sovereignty in the United Nations, how does the world's great hegemon then necessarily violate that sovereignty in order to exercise its asymmetric power? Well, that's what they created the CIA to do. The way you do it is you do it covertly. You don't invade. That's, of course, a gross transgression. I talked about that earlier. But you send in a few agents and you manipulate and you maneuver and you do it covertly. And it grounds in the principle of plausible deniability. If you get caught doing it, you deny it. So it never happened. And that's the whole logic of the CIA during the Cold War, when the superpower rivalry meant that much of international intercourse was conducted covertly. The Soviets were doing the same sort of thing. And the level of human rights, at the same time that we are ratifying, Eleanor Roosevelt was the first chair of the UN Human Rights Commission, and she was the one that led the drafting of the convention. She played a seminal role, etc. The United States played a key role in the Geneva Conventions, and these all protect human rights. At the same time, in the exercise of its global power, the United States was developing very sophisticated techniques of psychological torture, which it propagated among its allies worldwide and which we're still dealing with today. Those techniques resurfaced at Abu Ghraib and Guantanamo, and the trial that goes on at Guantanamo today, a recent letter by 7 mid-ranking U.S. military officers who are serving in the Guantanamo courts denouncing the gross human rights violations of the CIA torture. I mean, that just came out a few weeks ago on the front page of the New York Times. I mean, we're still dealing with the reality that one of the most egregious violations of human rights is torture. And the United States was not only promoting the principle of human rights, but also the practice of torture. Now, if you will, the kind of genius of the US system is that our principles have taken on an institutional form in international law, in the United Nations, in the World Trade Organization, the World Health Organization, in hundreds of international organizations that have an institutional and legal life greater than us. And the critical question we're now facing is, as the power, US global power, fades, will the liberal international system, the manifestation of these principles, will it survive? And I would argue that that would be a great loss. I mean, humanity has paid a horrific price, as I actually explain in the book in great detail, because it's a continuous evolution in the debate in the West over human rights. All right, humanity has paid an enormous price in suffering, the slave trade, etc., in creating these principles, and their loss, I think, would be something of a tragedy. And China's world system has very little respect for the fabric of international law. They've demonstrated that very clearly after they lost that case with the Philippines over the South China Sea at the Permanent Court of Arbitration in The Hague. China just dismissed the whole rubric of international law out of hand. And of course, their treatment of the Tibetans and Uyghurs is, a gross transgression of human rights of huge numbers of people in their society, and they walk away from it. So I think China's system is going to be transactional, and we could be facing a degradation of these important principles.
All right, and then kind of going off of what you said about China, there's a question here: how should we want the US government to act or respond regarding the perceived threat to Taiwan and the Straits in the South China Sea?
Yeah, that's a really difficult question.
Yeah, it's
really a big one. The reality is that if we push too hard, China does have the couple thousand jet fighters, a vast armada of ballistic missiles. I mean, it's one thing that's very hard for Americans to realize. Okay, we've been powerful so long. Okay, but China's ahead of us. Okay, I mean, their anti-missile defenses are far superior to our own. All right, and you may have heard that the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff testified in Congress, and he said that, China looks like it's about to develop a hypersonic missile. This is a missile that flies somewhere close to 5,000 miles an hour, and that it can breach it, all of our anti-missile defenses. The U.S. has been experimenting with hypersonic missiles, and we haven't succeeded. All of our tests have failed. Of course, they're flying so fast they burn up. So it's a tricky technology. It looks like China's got it. The same thing is much of the 3 C's, or what the military calls the 3 C's: command, control, and communication. All of that, except for the submarines, is in satellites. The United States has 100 satellites up in the sky. Well, China has the satellites communicate via microwaves, and they're easy to hack. China has moved to a system of basically a photovoltaic transmission of communication to its satellites that you can't hack. So they're ahead of us. And if it came to war close to China's coast, they have what are called carrier killer missiles. These massive behemoths, the dozen of the most powerful, mighty ships on the seas. Well, in a war, they are just simply bigger targets. and they can be sunk very fast. And so, if we push it, we can suffer a major, major defeat over Taiwan. And yet, what do we do? Just abandon it? Well, it's a conundrum. And it's that conundrum that China can play upon to its advantage and push us ever more steadily away from the China coast. Look, this is something that I thought about in this book is, what's the purpose of naval power? I mean, you look at the number of battles that navies actually fight in history, and they're extremely infrequent. And so the point of a navy for the exercise of global power is to weave a kind of cat's cradle of patrols in the open seas and turn this portion of the commons into your private space, kind of your transitory private space, because you've got more ships sailing back and forth and controlling it than anybody else. And then you can control that strategically. You can mine the undersea resources, you can fish the seas, etc. You can make those seas de facto your own. And that's what China is doing. Their first target is what they call the first island chain, which essentially runs from Japan through Taiwan, the Philippines, down towards Australia. And then what they really want is what they call the second island chain, which runs through the Marianas. They want to sort of split the Pacific with the United States. And lest we forget, during the first half of the 20th century, Japan and the United States were heading to war over who was going to rule the Pacific. And America's great victory in the Pacific in World War II meant it was our ocean in its entirety. Well, that's now changing.
Yeah, definitely complicated. And then I see someone who has their hand up. So let me see if I can let them unmute.
I'm staying muted for the moment because I'm on a bus. It'll be too noisy.
All right. I see another hand right here.
Am I unmuted yet?
Yeah, you are.
So my question deals with the book I read that you wrote about the Philippines and going back to 1898 and how we were, in a sense, spying on the people, and we turned the Philippines into some sort of police state. And I think we did something similar with Puerto Rico. And so our history, it seems like, with darker people in America is not always something to be proud of. And I'm wondering how much of this will come back to really bite us. I mean, the stuff we did in Vietnam with the whole heroin, opium stuff, and all these other things we do in Central and South America with the drug enforcement agencies. It just seems like we have such a murky history. We're not as noble as we want to believe we are. At what point will this start to really damage our reputation, or will it?
Yeah, very good and very complex question. And I wish there were an easy answer. All I can do is kind of speculate and think, and perhaps inadequately. But first of all, what you're talking about, if I were to categorize it, and please forgive me if I don't get it quite right, is that duality of power that I talked about, that every world system has. And in terms of transgression and violating our own rules, that's part of the realpolitik of the exercise of imperial power. And so, as I said, the United States has, during its 70 going on 80 years of global hegemony, at the same time propagated some very admirable principles, which are in many ways the culmination of centuries of cogitation, reflection, and debate by thinkers and lawyers and wise persons. At the same time, we've exercised a very harsh imperial power, but that's the duality of every world order. Is that gaping, yawning chasm between the admirable principles and the quite horrific practices. And we have been no better or worse than any of the other world orders that preceded us. I mean, I just very quickly, the Iberian World Order, for example. One of the things that I think I mentioned at the outset, that there are three variables to define a world order: human rights, sovereignty, and energy. And the energy seems a little odd and out of place, but think about it, okay? The Iberian World Order created two key artifacts: the sailing ship, the Caravela de Armada, with a triangular sail that could master the winds, and thus harness wind power for global exploration and commerce and all the rest. And the Portuguese invented the slave plantation in islands off the coast of Africa, Madeira and Sao Tome. And they discovered the extraordinary profitability of plantation sugar, slave plantation sugar cultivation. And as the form spread, of course, across to Brazil and then the Caribbean, and the Spanish committed these slaughters in the Americas, particularly in the Caribbean, there was a labor shortage, and so they began the slave trade. And so these monstrous crimes also produced these incredible violations of humanity, also produced the first articulation of universal human rights. And that duality defined the Iberian World Order. The British, in their era, picking up on this continuous debate over slavery that had gone on for centuries in Europe, in 1807, they abolished the slave trade, and the Treaty of the Congress of Vienna that ended the Napoleonic Wars actually contains an extensive article, Article 15, most people are aware of this, that condemns the slave trade with ringing rhetoric that you could actually sort of put in the UN Charter. I mean, there's no compromise. They call it an abomination, etc. Okay, and so the British spent 80 years and 2% of their gross national product in extirpating the Atlantic slave trade. The Royal Navy's largest project from 1815 until the 1880s, when it was over, was the extirpation of the slave trade. There were no other wars. 15,000 British sailors, 2% of British gross national product, etc. I mean, it was a great triumph in extirpating this evil. At the same time, the British were spreading colonies around the globe and introducing a form of coerced labor, of compelled work by all colonial subjects in lieu of cash taxes. That was a form of bondage. So, again, duality. And also they propagated a doctrine of scientific racialism, of higher and lesser breeds, that these people were inferior and they needed this alien administration for their uplift. I mean, okay, so again, a duality. And so, and in our turn, the duality in the US system is as I described it. And China has a similar duality in its emerging system. The legitimation, if the legitimation of the American system is we promoted democracy and development, okay, China's legitimation, if you read the speeches of Xi Jinping, he's very proud at every international gathering. He talks about the 60 million Chinese that have been uplifted from misery. And he talks about the Belt and Road Initiative, this $1.2 trillion global development, it's a Eurasian African development project that is the greatest development project in human history, uplifting the peoples of Asia and Africa and Central Asia and Eastern Europe from poverty, in some cases, very extreme poverty. And okay, at the same time, they're doing this by the propagation of fossil fuels. China builds an enormous number of coal-fired electrical plants as a part of its infrastructure development. So China has this duality of offering uplift and prosperity. At the same time, its mechanism of doing so is in the fossil fuels that is going to condemn many of these same people to being uprooted and to the loss of their perch on these precarious fringes and seashore and floodplain and desert fringe, and driving, 200 million to 1 billion people to become climate change refugees. So each system has its duality.
All right, and then I see a few more questions here. And looks like it's almost 8 o'clock, so probably like one or two more quick questions.
Thank you. I don't know where to begin now. I had it for a moment. We are now talking about a system of the wrong equivalencies. Nations that have striven to and are bringing their populations up out of poverty or into care, into literacy, into everybody drinking milk, which Cuba used to be able to do, except now, of course, the blockade is doing terrible things to Cuba. And the reason for the blockade is its political success. The United States is driven mad by the success of a socialist struggle. I was going to ask that J. Wilberforce be called on. His hand was up and he's got his hand up again, but I want to make these points. So these leftists, as they're called, these socialist going efforts are being maligned here. They're being cast as wrong. Yes, China's using fuel, fossil fuel, but it's going to, it's challenging that, and it's going to work in opposition to doing that. And it will have then enforced or reinforced a populace that's able to commit the struggle that's necessary to get us, to get all of them and us, the rest of us, to be able, us to provide everything for all of us, by all of us, which is, of course, what the communist revolutions are about. And it's being told to us as though, oh, that's not important. People eating and people educating and people getting health care, that's not important.
Just a quick comment, not to answer or to address your statement directly, but to kind of speak to the spirit of, I think, what your remark is. In the US press, I'm struck by the consistent drumbeat of this criticism of the Belt and Road Initiative. First of all, the Marshall Plan, which the US, quite altruistically and a bit of self-interest as well, introduced at the end of World War II to actually rebuild and feed literally a starving Europe. That was about $100 billion when corrected for inflation. It was actually $13 billion worth about, back then, worth about $100 billion today. The Belt and Road Initiative is 10 or 12 times the size of the Marshall Plan. And up to this point in human history, the Marshall Plan was the biggest single development project in human history. Well, the Belt and Road Initiative is enormous. It transcends it by many fold. And moreover, it's mobilizing capital in the country's counterpart funds. So each project requires local input. So it's actually far bigger than that. It's probably overall about an $8 trillion program. It's enormous. And in terms of purchasing power equity, the Chinese are much more efficient in their contracting, lower wages, state industries, et cetera. So they're getting a lot of bang for the buck, or the yuan, as the case might be. Okay. And when you think about it, during the Cold War, we had elaborate development programs in competition with the Soviet Union to develop third world economies and uplift them. And when the Cold War was over, we all decided that, well, okay, we're going to now go to a neoliberal global system where it's all going to be done on the basis of bank loans or maybe development loans, all with interest. And, that attempt to end poverty ended. China is literally reaching out to these forgotten hundreds of millions of people in a way that, we didn't, and we don't actually have the resources to do. And it's an extraordinary effort. And if you read the US press, it's a constant drumbeat of criticism. It's debt colonialism. It's white elephant projects. It's wasted frippery. And there was a study done at Johns Hopkins University of 1,000 loans under the Belt and Road Initiative and concluded that the charges were pretty much wrong. The interest rates were reasonable. The projects were pretty sound. The drumbeat in the press of criticism is just misguided. So I don't think most Americans are aware of the sheer scale of what China is doing. It's just enormous.
Yes, they're winning, and we have to watch out for the victory of socialists and communist aggression.
Actually, you mentioned the winning. Again, as with all great global powers, there is self-interest in China's altruism, always is, has to be, the way the world works. But what China is doing is China is laying down, and Xi Jinping, when he announced the Belt and Road Initiative in 2013, was absolutely clear. They're laying down a grid of infrastructure and commerce from the Baltic Sea to the South China Sea and East China Sea, all the way across the 6,000 miles of the vast Eurasian landmass that's going to integrate this, historically two separate continents into a single production unit through these vast infrastructure projects. And if that works, as if almost by natural law, power and product and profit will flow to Beijing. Oh, and one last thing. One thing that the book does in great detail, and I commend it to your attention, because it's an elusive concept. But once you get your head around it, it's a concept of geopolitics. People use the term all the time, don't really explain it, don't really analyze it, don't show how it can be used. One thing I did in the book, which I thought was, was what I set out to do, and I think it worked, is I began to apply geopolitics to these global shifts. And one thing I realized in the study of geopolitics, the succession of hegemonic powers from Portugal to Holland to Britain to the United States and now China, is that, over the past 600 years, there is one attribute that each of these successive global hegemons has shared. Each has struggled to dominate the Eurasian landmass and the continent of Africa. And that is the epicenter of world power. And if you dominate Eurasia, you are dominating the preponderance of humanity and its productivity. And that's what China is doing with this Belt and Road Initiative and these naval initiatives. They're laying down this grid across the continent. They've also built 40 ports, and I have a map of them in my book, ringing the Eurasian continent, around Africa, around Europe, all right? And then they're puncturing outward with their naval power, pushing the United States backward and cutting the rings of steel that at the apex of our power, we lay across the continent of Eurasia.
And I think we're running short-ish on time, so I'm just going to do one last question. It looks like we have one raised hand. Sorry, just one sec.
I guess that would be me. Thanks, Al. Thanks for your work. Thanks for your originating book, The Politics of Heroin in Southeast Asia. On China, it just happens. Well, first of all, just as many of us, at least I, am turning more and more toward the local, you seem to be advocating sort of global governance solutions. And I'm a bit skeptical of that. And maybe you could speak to that a little. And certainly in terms of a political project, it's like so out of reach. Even our local government is out of reach in many instances. The second thing is, just earlier today, I went to two different talks that happened to be about China. One by a man named Kaplan, who's the author of a new book called, I think, Patient Capital, about how China are engaged in the world. And there's a bit of a critique there. Of course, it gets beyond the superficial stereotype that you mentioned, but that China is actually tying governments to commercial relations to China, getting their products from Chinese companies. But specifically, in terms of global warming, China are promoting nuclear power for example, in Argentina. And the United States and Western Europe are backing away from nuclear power. I'm not a fan of it, but there are people who continue to argue that it's part of a package of energy options that ought to be considered in terms of addressing global warming. And if China is doing that, you mentioned coal, but apparently they're promoting nuclear as well. So could you maybe speak a little about that aspect of China's foreign engagement? And thank you.
Yeah, sorry, I'm not aware of I'm sorry, my knowledge, like everything, is finite. I was not aware that that was a major Chinese initiative. But like everybody else, I'm suddenly faced with a re-estimation of nuclear power. And in Europe, there's a really serious debate over this issue, because I think France, and if I have my statistics correct, generates something like 70% of its electricity from nuclear power. Germany and the Green Movement had a very long struggle to try and eradicate or eliminate nuclear power in Germany, and that debate is still ongoing. I think that, you know, nuclear power has one advantage: and no CO2 emissions, no methane emissions. Yes, there's a problem of the storage, the safe storage of the nuclear fuel, but, you know, a couple of things are happening with nuclear technology. One is that the reactors are much more efficient, so there's far less waste than there used to be. And two, it's the rise of what you might call the mini nuclear reactor, all right? That engineers have been developing smaller nuclear reactors, so we don't have to build massive installations like 3 Mile Island, Fukushima, or Chernobyl. With
right, the term is small modular reactors, SMRs.
Right, and the advantage of them is, as with all engineering projects, you build more and more units, they become more efficient and they become safer. The other advantage of the smaller units is that if there's an accident, it's not, you know, Chernobyl proportions, a disaster of the first water. It can be contained and managed. And so, you know, one of the problems of the grid is if we move to solar and wind, it's erratic. The sun doesn't always shine, the wind doesn't always blow. We know this. And the grids, even regional grids, require a constant level of power to maintain stability within the grid. And so there needs to be some regular source of reliable power to fill in the gaps. And from an emissions perspective, nuclear is starting to look pretty good. We haven't come up with an alternative yet. And so, you know, it may be the time for nuclear power to come back. And already at the University of Wisconsin, where we have had for many years a very good nuclear engineering department, they're talking about expanding research and beginning to participate in, you know, a nuclear powered grid and innovations in the nuclear power grid in order to facilitate the reduction of emissions. So, you know, yes, that's an important change.
All right, and then I see one last hand up here. Christine, sorry, just trying to unmute you there.
Just a, Annika, could I, there's one other point that I'd like to come back
Oh,
to.
of course, sorry.
Sorry, that about the balance between, you know, the global and the local, you know, acting locally versus acting globally. First of all, the UN, as we now know it, took shape because civil society organizations and turned up in San Francisco, and they had ideas very different from what the great powers, what Russia and the United States and Britain and France wanted out of the UN. And they, right from the beginning, that kind of activism shaped the UN as we know it. And as we've seen with, you know, the popular protests, the mobilization by Generation Z, the power of this protest to keep this issue alive, to put it on the agenda of every country around the globe, that's absolutely critical. It's going to take not just, financiers with what, $130 trillion promising to rewrite the structure of the global economy. No, I mean, that's part of it, but it's going to take political mobilization. And so, the old, act local, think global, that saying, it's still with us. In order for us to survive locally, we are going to have to, more than ever before, act globally.
I guess my question is something to the effect of, I guess I have this imagined thought that the Chinese are very good at planning 100 years ahead and executing on that and promoting the brightest and in many cases, when it's outside of politics, maybe academically, at least they have some of they cultivate talent. I'm not saying that they don't have political favorites and what have you that are promoted based on nepotism. But in any case, I guess I'm wondering if they would be sort of benevolent in their operations, shall we say, and that we might be our own worst enemies if the US counters them. That's about it for my ill-formed question.
Yeah, that's we're all dealing with the future, and we're struggling to give it form in our thoughts because we're living in a time where these future projections are very real, and in order to have the worst happen, all of these climate change projections operate in a kind of best case and worst case scenario and points in between, and so we are in a situation where the way we live in 5 or 10 years from now is going to be determined by actions we take today. The way we live in 50 years from now is certainly going to be determined by actions we take today. So we have to engage the future as we never have before. And are the Chinese, to go to one part of your question, are they better at the future than we are? Well, they are a command economy. I mean, they're a command economy with a private sector. And they do engage in, they have 5-year plans, right? And the 5-year plans have allocation of resources to the full range of the of social activities. So, for example, in climate change, the former Massachusetts Senator John Kerry, who is now our climate ambassador, got together with China and they came up with a declaration at Glasgow for joint action on climate by the United States and China. And if you read that declaration, China says that it will, this is where the phase down thing came from. They're going to phase down the use of coal, not phase out, phase down the use of coal, starting with I think it's the 14th 5-year plan. What does that mean? Well, I remember they're now in the 13th 5-year plan, which is 2020 to 25. So they're going to start doing this in their next 5-year plan, 2025 to 2030. And those plans actually will affect their allocation of resources. Are they better at this than we are? Well, that allocation of resources is a double-edged sword. I mean, right now that allocation of resources is skewed towards economic growth, adequate electricity and power to fuel it, and coal. And they're committed. Xi Jinping is committed to carbon neutral by 2060. Well, 2060 is, that's way too late. So their planning, in a certain sense, is a double-edged sword. It allows them to do certain things very effectively, but it also allows them to push critical issues out over the horizon.
All right. So looks like those are all the questions we have. So thank you so much. Is there anything else you want to bring up or anything that you want to elaborate on before we end this webinar?
No, I mean, actually, every conversation has its twists and turns. This is, I don't know, it's been sobering in a sense, because it's made me realize how much I don't know and how uncertain things are. And it's made me feel positive in another sense, that it's clear that, that organizing and struggling for a better future is not just an option. It's not a choice anymore. It's an imperative. So, that's, I guess, what I come away with from this conversation. So I want to thank everybody for sort of letting me ruminate and reflect and fumble around and realize what I don't know as much as what I do know.
Thank you so much. And just as a reminder, Al McCoy's new book, To Govern the Globe, is out now. I know you can buy it on Amazon. I'm assuming it would be at bookstores too. You probably know that better than I do.
Hopefully it's at a bookstore, but
Yeah.
who knows? You can certainly get it at Amazon.com. Thanks, Danica, for having me. Bye, guys. Have a good
So
night. Thank you all for listening.